There was a bulldozer parked on my property and a neon yellow sign duct-taped to the front of my barn that read, "Future site of Maple Ridge Community Center construction begins next week." I blinked twice, thinking maybe I was still asleep and dreaming, or hallucinating from heatstroke. But no, the cement trucks in the distance and the smug lady waving from a lawn chair under a pink umbrella confirmed that this was all terribly real. That barn they were trying to claim? It wasn't just a barn, it was a classified federal bunker, and those idiots were about to find out the hard way. It started 3 days earlier when I returned home from a supply run in town to find my driveway partially blocked by an HOA truck. That wasn't unusual in Maple Ridge, especially with the new board flexing their beautification initiative, but this time there was a rolled-up scroll taped to my mailbox like some medieval decree. It was a notice, an HOA zoning adaptation, apparently unanimously voted on during some mystery meeting I was never told about. According to the document, the board had repurposed the old structures on non-essential land for community usage. And guess whose barn sat right on that redrawn zone? Mine. Now, I've dealt with the HOA before. I know their game. Fines for invisible weeds, threats over mailbox paint colors, one time even a cease and desist over wind chimes being audibly aggressive. But this was insanity. Not only was that barn mine, it had been in my family for generations. On paper. Off paper, it was something entirely different. Built in the early 1960s under the guise of a grain storage facility, the barn had a hidden steel hatch, biometric locks, and a 2-story subterranean level stocked with federal tech that could make a prepper cry with joy. But none of that was visible from the road. And that's how it was meant to be. The next morning, I visited the HOA office. It was in one of those repurposed homes with a fake, civic look, columns, fresh mulch, flags on every corner. Karen herself greeted me with a smile that looked like it was surgically stapled to her face. She was in her usual peach pantsuit and oversized sunglasses, sipping sparkling water and holding court behind a fake marble desk. I explained, calmly, that the barn was not just mine but also classified and absolutely off-limits. She listened, blinked slowly, and said, "Oh, sweetie, all barns are classified when people don't want to share." Then she told me the board voted, the maps were updated, and if I had a problem, I could submit a complaint in writing to the landscaping subcommittee. At that point, I realized I was not dealing with logic. Karen was on a power trip, and my barn was her next trophy. I walked out before I said something that would put me on a watch list. Later that night, I got a call from my neighbor Gary, who lives just across the property line. He whispered like he was part of a spy movie and told me he saw a crew poking around the barn after sundown. I checked my camera feed. Sure enough, 2 men with clipboards and flashlights were walking the perimeter. One of them actually tried prying a side panel with a crowbar before a red laser light painted his chest. That was the barn's internal proximity system activating. Lucky for them, I had the lethal deterrence disabled, just in case the local deer ever got too curious. By morning, things escalated. A surveyor was sent with a drone to map the construction area, which apparently included half my yard and all of my vegetable beds. I confronted him, told him to get the drone out of my airspace. He said Karen gave him air clearance. I told him the federal government outranks Karen. He laughed. Then the barn's defense protocol activated and zapped the drone with a high-frequency pulse. That shut him up real quick. I didn't want to escalate too early. My federal contact at the Office of Infrastructure Integrity once told me, "Only call us if they breach a perimeter or touch the core systems." So for now, I documented everything. Every visit, every email, every Karen sighting. Then came the kicker. 2 HOA board members showed up at my door pretending to be historic registry evaluators. They even wore fake ID lanyards that said Community Site Appraisal Unit. I almost laughed. One of them tried peeking into my garage. Another asked if there was any asbestos in the barn and if I had access to blueprints. When I asked them to leave, They said the HOA had already acquired administrative control of the structure pending final paperwork. Final paperwork? These clowns really thought they could just take over something they didn't understand, like it was a lemonade stand. That's when I made the call. I pulled the emergency protocol key from the hidden panel under my kitchen sink, inserted it into the panel in the living room wall, and sent the classified alert. Less than 10 minutes later, I received a secured call back from Washington. All I had to say was, "They've breached the barn's threshold and are initiating unauthorized access. This is custodian code black." The voice on the other end said, "Lock it down. We're en route." I walked back outside, nodded at the so-called evaluators, and said, "You might want to move your cars. You're parked in a restricted blast radius." They looked at each other, confused, then scurried to their SUV. Karen stood by the sidewalk with her phone out, recording everything. "You'll be hearing from our attorney," she yelled. I smiled and waved. "You'll be hearing from the Department of Homeland Security," I replied. And just like that, the real countdown began. I wasn't just protecting my property anymore. I was about to bury the HOA in the very paperwork they thought would take me down. They wanted my barn for bake sales and bingo night. But they were messing with something far older, far deeper, and far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. You said. The news of the barn's supposed repurposing spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning, I had 5 voicemails from residents asking when the community center events were starting, one from a yoga instructor requesting to book a class inside the barn, and even a food truck vendor asking about electricity hookups for a chili cook-off. Karen wasn't just pushing her agenda, she had already sold it to the entire neighborhood. Flyers were going around, calling it the Heart of Maple Ridge Project, with sketches of kids playing in front of a red barn, not realizing it sat on top of a reinforced steel vault with electromagnetic shielding and a blast-resistant core. I wasn't sure whether to laugh, cry, or call in a drone strike. Meanwhile, Karen decided to throw fuel on the fire with a community meeting at the HOA office that evening. I attended out of pure obligation, hoping for some rational voices. Instead, it felt like a bad episode of a daytime soap opera mixed with a real estate seminar. She stood at the front, a slideshow projected behind her showing her grand vision. The barn turned into a welcome center with glass doors, open seating, and a mural of herself painted on one wall. There were even fake testimonials, neighbors I knew had never spoken to her in their life suddenly endorsing the project. One of them, old Mr. Banner, who barely left his porch, had supposedly said, "It's about time we had a center for the people." When Karen invited questions, I raised my hand. She rolled her eyes and pretended not to see me, then gestured to someone in the front row. "Yes, Linda?" A woman with 6 bags of HOA merch clutched to her chest gushed. "Will there be a community wine fridge?" That's when I stood up and calmly addressed the room, explaining that the barn was not eligible for conversion under any HOA guideline, let alone federal law. I tried to phrase it lightly, saying the barn served a historic preservation purpose that couldn't be publicly disclosed, but Karen cut me off mid-sentence, saying I was gatekeeping community growth and possibly squatting on federal resources. It was so insane I actually laughed. That's when she told me I was being fined for obstruction of community development. The fine arrived in my mailbox the next day, $2,800 due within 10 days. Apparently, I was also being billed for emergency lawn correction because the trucks had compacted part of the HOA flower path. That path was something she just made up. It was a strip of grass between a drainage ditch and an old fence, but in her mind, it was a sacred boulevard to future civic pride. At this point, it was clear. Karen wasn't just misinformed. She was delusional, dangerous, and entirely too confident. Then the surveillance began. It started small, just a camera mounted near the road facing my property. Then another one popped up closer to the barn. I checked the footage from my own internal feeds and watched 2 HOA contractors installing it, pretending to fix a fallen signpost. They weren't subtle. I caught one of them peeking through binoculars while sipping an energy drink, nodding like he was on a stakeout. The next day, I found tire marks in the grass behind the barn, an attempt at sneaking through the back entrance. They didn't know the perimeter sensors were already scanning every inch and relaying data to a secure server in a building 2 states away. It was around this time Karen sent her son Tyler, who had recently graduated from an online security school and now called himself a private infrastructure consultant. I found him skulking around the side fence with a thermal scanner and what looked like a homemade electromagnetic pulse tester. I asked him what he was doing, and he actually replied, "Just doing some light grid analysis. HOA authorization." I told him if he didn't step back beyond the marker within 5 seconds, he'd have a sudden lesson in what federal-grade acoustic deterrence felt like. He ran so fast he dropped the scanner, which I found later and stored inside the barn, tagged as Unauthorized Civilian Tech, Exhibit A. That night, Karen escalated again. She sent an email blast to the entire community with the subject line, "Exposing the barn mystery." In it, she claimed the structure had been left abandoned for decades, accused me of suspicious late-night activity, and stated that the HOA had filed an eminent domain adjustment with the City Council to reclassify the land for public use. I knew it was a bluff. There was no such thing as an eminent domain adjustment. The HOA could file without city authority, and even if there were, it wouldn't override federal preservation protocols. But the damage was done. Neighbors started gawking at the barn like it was Area 51. Kids dared each other to touch the side panel. Someone left a note on my fence asking if aliens lived inside. I considered revealing the truth, but I couldn't. My contract with the Office of Infrastructure Integrity required silence unless national security was compromised. But what I could do was prepare. I activated the Stage 2 lockdown protocol. From the outside, nothing looked different. But deep inside, the systems were arming. Internal motion sensors synced with layered surveillance, remote verification checks kicked in, and a perimeter alert quietly triggered a red flag in a federal watchlist system. If Karen or anyone from the HOA breached the barn again, it wouldn't be me they had to answer to. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get more absurd, I received a letter from the HOA's legal advisor, who turned out to be Karen's cousin from Michigan and apparently not even licensed in our state. The letter threatened to sue me for inhibiting social advancement and demanded that I hand over all structural keys and access code. I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. I didn't even have the full access codes myself. Most of them were controlled remotely by the OII, encrypted and buried in a protocol chain that required multi-agency clearance to override. I responded with a formal cease and desist letter, citing state property laws, trespassing statutes, and of course, vague references to federal jurisdiction. I didn't sign it with my name. I signed it Custodian, National Infrastructure Zone 7D. That ought to spook them a little. By the end of the week, I had half the town thinking I was a reclusive weirdo guarding treasure, a quarter believing I was part of a government conspiracy, and one overly enthusiastic teenager trying to become my intern. But none of that compared to what came next. Because while Karen was busy throwing around phony documents and HOA flags like she ran the place, the federal agents had already booked their flights. The moment she crossed the line, truly crossed it, they'd descend like hawks. And based on her latest move, she was getting dangerously close. She filed for demolition permits. For my barn. For a bunker. She had no idea what she was about to unleash. It happened on a Saturday morning, just as the sun broke over the horizon and the neighborhood was still wrapped in sleep. A low rumble echoed through the cul-de-sac, shaking coffee cups off tables and sending pets into hiding. I looked out my window to see the absurd sight of 2 bulldozers, a rented backhoe, and a caravan of pickup trucks rolling down the road like they were invading Normandy. At the center of the chaos stood Karen, wearing a construction vest 2 sizes too small, holding a clipboard like it was the Constitution itself, and grinning like she'd already declared victory. On her neon vest were the words, Project Overseer, written in bold black marker, as if the title would give her immunity. She had no clue what she had just walked into. They parked the equipment right up against my fence, blocking my driveway and part of the street, then started unloading plastic folding chairs and one of those oversized ribbon-cutting scissors. It was clear Karen wasn't just planning to break ground, she was staging a full media spectacle. A local reporter and a man with a drone camera were already setting up for the launch. Balloons were tied to a fence post. One of her cronies was setting up a banner that said, "Welcome to the heart of Maple Ridge," which flapped over the gate to my barn like it had already been claimed. But while they were busy patting themselves on the back, the real storm was silently stirring underground. I stepped outside just as the contractors lined up for Karen's big speech. She cleared her throat, smacked a cue card against her palm, and began. Today is a moment of history for our community. We're reclaiming a neglected space and transforming it into a hub of joy, wellness, and neighborly connection. I raised a brow as she dramatically gestured to my barn. This, our new community center, will be a place of unity, growth, and above all, belonging. There was mild applause. Someone handed her a bottle of sparkling cider and a bell to ring. I decided to let her finish her circus act before stepping in, because in just a few moments, her little dream would fall apart in glorious fashion. As the first bulldozer's engine roared to life, I walked calmly to the center of my yard. Karen noticed me and shouted over the microphone, "Please remain behind the fence, sir. We've already filed the necessary permits." The crowd turned to look. I waved politely, pulled a small device from my pocket, and pressed a red button. Instantly, a low hum vibrated through the air, and the ground around the barn shifted. Metal clanks echoed beneath the surface. Hydraulic locks hissed. The barn transformed. What was once a dusty, humble wooden building now stood fortified with sliding steel panels, laser perimeter tripwires flickering around the base, and 2 armored doors that began to rise from the ground like the gates of a vault. Karen froze mid-sentence. Her grip tightened on the mic as the bulldozer operator cut the engine and slowly backed away from the barn, blinking at the sudden shift from farm aesthetic to military-grade infrastructure. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped their camera. The banner sagged in the wind. I walked forward slowly, pausing at the gate, and said loud enough for all to hear, "This is federal property under protection by the National Infrastructure Security Act. Any attempt to breach, demolish, or repurpose this facility is a felony offense punishable by up to 30 years in federal prison." Karen laughed, but it was nervous now, trembling around the edges. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "This is a barn. You can't just dress it up like a spaceship and claim national security." I turned to her calmly and replied, "Would you like to argue that point with the Office of Infrastructure Integrity?" Right on cue, a convoy of black SUVs came speeding down the street. Neighbors stepped onto porches. Phones were raised. The vehicles stopped abruptly and a team of serious-looking agents stepped out, all in black suits with lapel pins that didn't require explanation. They moved fast, 2 heading to the contractors, 1 heading to Karen, and the rest securing the area like they were expecting a breach. Karen tried to stand her ground, but one of the agents pulled her aside and began calmly but firmly questioning her about the demolition order. Her face paled. Her mouth moved but no words came out. One of her assistants tried to run for it but tripped over a stack of traffic cones. An agent approached me, nodded, and said, "Custodian, we have control. Perimeter is secured. Breach attempt recorded and being processed. Awaiting extraction orders for unauthorized personnel." I nodded and pointed to Karen, who was still protesting that she had authority. "She signed everything herself," I said. "Forged city documents. Tried to impersonate an official department." The agent didn't react. He just clicked his radio and said, "1 civilian under probable cause. Processing now." Within seconds, 2 more agents approached Karen, asked for identification, and then informed her she would be taken in for questioning. She screamed about her rights. She shouted about HOA jurisdiction. One agent calmly held up a document stamped with a federal seal and said, "This is not a matter of community landscaping. This is a federal infrastructure zone. You've tampered with protected assets and disrupted classified systems." The crowd that had gathered to witness a ribbon cutting was now watching their HOA president being placed in the back of an unmarked vehicle. Someone recorded it on their phone. Someone else clapped. The banner was torn down by one of the agents and placed into a box labeled "Seized Materials." The ribbon-cutting scissors were confiscated as potential evidence. A small girl asked her mom if the barn was going to launch into space. The mom replied, "No, sweetie, that's just where Karen's dreams go." As the vehicles drove off and the contractors scattered, I stood alone beside the barn. The system slowly powered down, returning to its disguised form. The steel doors receded. The wooden siding panels slid back into place. And once again, it was just a barn. At least on the outside. I turned and walked back toward my porch, greeted by a stunned but curious crowd of neighbors now whispering about what had just happened. One of them approached and asked, "Is it true? Is that place really?" I stopped him with a raised hand. "All I'll say is this," I replied. "Next time Karen wants to hold a bake sale, maybe try the rec center instead." I stepped inside my house, finally able to exhale. My phone buzzed. Another encrypted message from the office. Status secure. Threat contained. Follow-up pending. I poured myself a coffee and sat at the window, watching as the last of the tire tracks faded into the dirt. Karen had tried to bulldoze her way into a secret no one was ever supposed to find. But now that she had, the fallout was just beginning. She thought she'd win a popularity contest. Instead, she triggered a federal investigation. And the best part? I wasn't even close to done with her yet. The explosion on social media happened faster than the agents could finish clearing the scene. Within hours, a blurry video of Karen being led away in handcuffs had gone viral. The caption read, "HOA president arrested trying to demolish government property." By that evening, local news picked it up, and then a major cable channel ran a short segment calling it the wildest zoning dispute in recent history. I couldn't go to the grocery store without someone stopping me to ask what I was hiding in that barn. A few asked if I was part of a secret government experiment. One guy insisted the barn was covering a missile silo and asked if I had ever met aliens. I told him only once. Her name was Karen. Back home, I was busy cataloging the damage. Although the barn itself was secure, the perimeter had been breached multiple times, sensors were knocked out of sync, and the interior warning systems had been tripped so often it required a full diagnostic sweep by a federal technician. The agents were already coordinating repairs, but they were also conducting a deeper investigation into Karen and the HOA's activities. One of the lead agents pulled me aside and informed me that Karen's little project had revealed more than just entitlement. It had exposed potential financial fraud, illegal surveillance activities, and multiple instances of forged signatures on HOA documents. It wasn't just about my barn anymore. It was about the way she had manipulated the entire neighborhood for personal gain, hiding behind HOA policies and fake authority. The fallout hit the HOA like a wrecking ball. A federal audit was launched, and suddenly, everyone who had cozied up to Karen started tripping over themselves trying to distance from her. Board members who had signed off on her community center idea claimed they never saw the final plans. The treasurer resigned via email and left town. One guy claimed Karen hypnotized him into supporting the project. Meanwhile, the HOA office was temporarily shut down and designated as part of the ongoing federal investigation. Ironically, the same flags Karen had proudly hung out front were now being used to mark evidence. Karen, however, wasn't done. Despite being under federal scrutiny and facing at least 3 serious charges, she somehow managed to secure bail and immediately gave a press interview from the steps of her lawyer's office. In a wrinkled blazer and oversized sunglasses, She addressed a small crowd of reporters and claimed she was the victim of a deep state prank and that I had weaponized bureaucracy to suppress community spirit. She even tried to portray herself as a martyr for neighborhood progress. I nearly choked on my coffee watching it live. She was unraveling in public and still thought she could spin it like she was the hero of some political drama. But the investigation kept tightening. The Department of Housing and Urban Development confirmed that Karen had submitted false grant applications using the barn as the centerpiece of her supposed revitalization project. She'd also funneled HOA funds into a shell company registered under her nephew's name to pay for things like banners, flyers, catered food, and even the rental equipment used for the would-be demolition. The worst part? She had convinced a few residents to donate, under the belief that it would increase their property value. One of the older residents, Mrs. Jensen, confessed to giving her over $4,000. She was heartbroken when she found out it had gone to pay for Karen's spa treatments and a massage chair. My role in all this kept growing as well. The federal office overseeing the investigation asked me to provide a full timeline of everything leading up to the attempted demolition, including the surveillance footage, copies of fake permits, and details of every HOA interaction. I compiled it into a thick binder and handed it off, knowing it might end up in court. At the same time, I filed my own legal action against the HOA for trespassing, property damage, and endangerment. Karen, included by name, was now facing civil litigation in addition to her criminal charges. Public opinion shifted drastically. Where once Karen had people singing her praises, now everyone treated her like she carried a contagious virus. Her house, once the venue for every community brunch and HOA potluck, was silent. No visitors, no mail, not even trash pickup. Someone plastered a sign on her garage door that read, "Community Terrorist HQ," and another person left a cardboard box filled with shredded HOA flyers on her lawn with a note that simply said, "Return to sender." Meanwhile, people began knocking on my door, not to complain, but to thank me. They brought pies, coffee, even a basket of handmade thank you cards from local kids. One guy offered me lifetime lawn mowing services for keeping the block from becoming a disaster zone. The HOA board was dissolved by an emergency community vote. The city stepped in temporarily to handle neighborhood functions while a new, resident-led committee was formed. No more power-hungry board members, no more surprise fines, and certainly no more unsolicited visits. One of the agents, during a follow-up inspection, chuckled and said, "You may have just saved your entire neighborhood from dictatorship, bunker guy." I told him I wasn't trying to be a hero, I was just trying to keep idiots off my property. I also got a letter from the Office of Infrastructure Integrity thanking me for maintaining the security of the site under exceptionally difficult public pressure. It included a federal commendation, an upgraded security clearance, and a formal plaque now installed near the barn, discreet but visible, reading, "National Infrastructure Protection Zone, restricted access by federal law." It didn't say what the barn was or what it housed, but the tone was enough to send any HOA enthusiast running. Still, Karen wasn't quite done flailing. From what I heard, she filed a countersuit claiming emotional distress, reputational damage, and unlawful intimidation via theatrical military displays. Her case was tossed out within minutes. The judge reportedly didn't even let her finish her opening statement before slamming the gavel. According to someone in the gallery, the judge muttered, "Lady, it's a miracle you're not in a federal facility right now." In the end, Karen's reign of HOA terror collapsed under its own weight. Her trial date was set. She was forced to sell her house to cover mounting legal fees. No one wanted to buy it, though, so the property sat empty, her legacy reduced to appealing for sale sign and a yard full of dead plants. Her name became a punchline around the neighborhood. Someone even made shirts that said, "Not today, Karen," with an image of a barn door snapping shut. And as for me, I went back to doing what I always did, minding my business, maintaining the barn, and keeping everything secure. But now, whenever I heard a knock at the door or saw someone loitering near the fence, I didn't panic. I smiled. Because now, everyone knew what that barn was. Or rather, what it wasn't. It wasn't a community center. It wasn't Karen's new playhouse. It was a line in the sand. And she'd learned, too late, never to cross it. The dust finally settled over Maple Ridge, but the memory of what happened didn't fade. The barn that once stood quietly in the background of everyone's lives had become a symbol, not just of federal secrets or hidden bunkers, but of limits, of lines that should never be crossed. The neighborhood had gone through a transformation. Without Karen's iron grip, people began to breathe differently. Yards got a little messier, mailboxes a little more personalized, and folks started waving again instead of inspecting each other's front porches. It was like everyone remembered they were neighbors and not participants in some bizarre suburban dictatorship. After the HOA was dissolved, the new community board, made up of 5 volunteers with no Karen-style ego complexes, asked if I would attend the first meeting just as a gesture of goodwill. I agreed, out of sheer curiosity more than anything. It was held in the small park by the duck pond, not in anyone's living room or commandeered garage. People brought lawn chairs, iced tea, even cookies. The vibe was casual, light, and refreshingly normal. I didn't speak much, just listened, but toward the end, one of the board members stood up and thanked me publicly. He said I protected the integrity of the neighborhood by standing up to overreach. I just nodded and tried not to laugh out loud. If only they knew how close Karen had come to accidentally triggering a national defense lockdown. A few weeks after that meeting, a black government vehicle rolled up quietly to my property. It wasn't unusual. I still had regular check-ins and maintenance visits from the HOA. But this time was different. A senior official I hadn't met before stepped out, holding a leather case. He shook my hand and said the agency had completed their internal report and that the barn's presence, despite the drama, had proven invaluable to national continuity planning. He handed me an upgraded certification and informed me that the facility was now part of a classified program known as Horizon Shield, meaning its role had expanded. I asked what that meant in practical terms, and he smiled and said, "It means more responsibility. And a little more respect." Then he nodded toward the side of the barn, where a new biometric scanner had been installed, one I hadn't even noticed being placed. They also installed a small but official sign. Not flashy, not alarming, just enough to make any future Karen think twice. It read, "National Infrastructure Site, trespassers will be prosecuted under federal law." Below that, in smaller print, "By order of the Office of Infrastructure Integrity." That was the final nail in the coffin for anyone still dreaming of garden clubs or yoga studios inside that structure. Karen's trial took place 3 months after her failed demolition attempt. I didn't attend in person, but I followed it closely. Her defense tried everything, blaming her legal team, accusing me of entrapment, even claiming she was misled by rogue contractors. The judge didn't buy a word of it. The footage, the forged paperwork, the bogus permits, it was all airtight. She was found guilty on multiple counts, including federal property interference, fraudulent zoning claims, and unauthorized surveillance. The sentencing was harsh but fair. 2 years in a minimum security facility, 5 years probation, and a lifetime ban from holding any HOA or community leadership role ever again. That last part got a standing ovation from her former neighbors. Her house, long abandoned, was auctioned off by the bank. It was bought by a young couple who had no idea of the saga until neighbors began telling stories. I met them once. They asked if the barn really had lasers. I told them no, not anymore. They laughed, not knowing that technically, I wasn't joking. Word around town was that Karen had filed one last complaint from prison, claiming her name was being unfairly used as a cautionary tale. No one paid attention. I went back to my routine. Days were quiet again. I worked on the property, did some minor repairs, and tended to the garden Karen once tried to claim was an unregistered ornamental zone. The air felt lighter. People waved more. Occasionally, someone would walk by with a new neighbor and point toward my barn like it was a local landmark. I never corrected them. Let the mystery live on. It was better that way. One day, I got a letter, an official one, from the Department of Homeland Security. It wasn't about inspections or upgrades. It was a thank you letter. Apparently, the barn systems had played a minor but crucial role in rerouting a power grid issue during a cyberattack simulation. No public threat, no headlines, just a quiet success. My role had been passive, just by keeping things maintained and following protocol. But still, the letter praised me for my continued stewardship and unwavering adherence to protocol in the face of public provocation. It was signed by the Undersecretary of National Resilience. I framed it and tucked it inside the barn, behind a locked cabinet. No need to hang it on the wall. I already knew what I'd done. The local paper ran a year-end article called Heroes of the Neighborhood. They listed a firefighter, a teacher, and, somehow, me. I wasn't interviewed. They just referred to me as the guy with the barn, and said my story was a reminder that sometimes, protecting your property isn't just about privacy, it's about principle. I figured that was a fair summary. Every now and then, I still think about Karen. Not in a vengeful way. More like a curious case study in what happens when entitlement meets immovable reality. She thought she could control everything with paperwork, charm, and intimidation. What she didn't count on was the one structure she couldn't bend, both metaphorically and literally. Her fall was as dramatic as her rise. But even now, I suspect she still believes she was in the right. Some people are just wired that way. As for the barn, it remained the same on the outside. Wood paneling, weathered roof, a few birds nesting near the rafters. Inside, it remained as protected and purpose-built as ever, humming softly with quiet power. And beneath it, buried deep, lay the systems most people would never see. Systems meant to hold firm when all else failed. Just like I had. And on the rare chance someone got bold again, tried to push their luck or peek too far behind the curtain, all it would take was one flip of a switch and a gentle reminder. This barn wasn't theirs. It never was. And it never would be.